Lady Arabella Wynters was London's most talked-about debutante, too sharp, too bold, and entirely too willing to walk into ruin, on her own terms. Claiming Lady Arabella, a slow-burn Regency romance begins now. Chapter 1. A thoroughly improper proposal. Mayfair, London 1815, the last ball of the season. The chandeliers glittered like fallen stars above the ballroom of the Marchioness of Bexley, their candlelight flickering in polished mirrors and on the pearls strung delicately about 100 elegant throats. Lady Arabella Wynters was every inch the scandalous rose of London, breathtaking, thorned, and in full bloom. Her complexion, touched with the faintest trace of rose, stood out against a sweep of storm-grey silk that clung to her like moonlight. A cascade of glossy black curls framed her face, half tamed by a single pearl comb that had already begun to slide free. Her mouth was a shade too full to be proper, her eyes far too sharp to be soft, and her smile far too knowing for a lady. Men admired her, mothers warned their sons. And Arabella? Arabella watched them all with an arched brow and a secret of her own. She stood at the edge of it all, a delicate glass of ratafia hanging forgotten in her gloved fingers. The drink, sweet, almond-scented, and as insincere as the compliments drifting through the ballroom, remained untouched. The air was thick with perfume and powder, the scent of violet water mingling with the sharp citrus of lemon ice and the candied sweetness of sugared apricots passed on silver salvers. Every inch of the room smelled like a dream one might choke on. "Smile," her mother hissed behind her fan. Lady Honoria's voice was honeyed venom, her silk-clad fingers tightening on Arabella's arm. "You are being watched." "I am smiling," Arabella replied without moving her lips. "Just not in your direction." "Lord Caraway is approaching." Arabella tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "How tiresome." "He is titled, unmarried, and foolish enough to find your wit charming. Do try to behave." Arabella turned, and there he was. Lord Edwin Caraway, Viscount of Devonmere. Dark-haired, green-eyed, and precisely the sort of man who never left a party with an empty dance card or an honest opinion. His jacket this evening was bottle green velvet with black lapels, a silver pin glinting at his cravat. He looked like temptation, if temptation were slightly overconfident and wore too much cologne. "Lady Arabella," he said, bowing low, "you are looking like thunder this evening." She arched a brow. "Is that meant as a compliment?" "If thunder commands attention and strikes fear into lesser men, yes." "Then you'd best tread carefully, my lord." They danced once, then again. Not because Arabella was charmed, she most certainly was not, but because nothing provoked the tawn quite like a woman appearing to enjoy herself without calculation. The tawn was what society called itself when it wished to sound more exclusive, more elegant, and far less English. And because, frankly, she was bored. Dancing twice with the same gentleman would raise precisely the sort of eyebrows that made life marginally more interesting. It was either that, or endure yet another simpering lecture on how a smile was a woman's sharpest weapon. Arabella preferred swords. After the second dance, Lord Caraway offered his arm and said, far too casually, "I know a place where the company is thinner and the refreshments stronger." She knew precisely what that meant. Every girl in the room did. A quiet corner, a lowered voice, the sort of suggestion that could ruin a season, or a life. But Arabella was so very tired. Tired of smiling when she did not feel it. Tired of lace gloves that pinched and mothers who whispered threats behind fans. She had danced. She had curtsied. She had played her part to perfection, and still they found fault. Still they talked. So, if she was to be ruined, let it be on her own terms. Her mother, at that moment, was too absorbed in scandalising Viscount Redgrave's choice of cravat to notice Arabella slipping away with a far greater scandal in tow. With perfect poise, she slipped her hand into the crook of Caraway's arm and said, "Lead the way." The Marchioness's library was dim, warm, and smelled of leather bindings and whispered indiscretions. A fire burned low in the grate. Caraway poured 2 glasses of ratafia and passed her one. "To your storm clouds," he said, touching his glass to hers. "And to thunder." Arabella took a sip and felt it then, that shift in the air. Not because of Lord Caraway, but because someone else had opened the door. Gasps, then the unmistakable flutter of silk skirts retreating. Arabella set her glass down and rose. At the threshold, 2 matrons from Lady Davenhall's circle stared like owls. One clutched her opera glasses as though they had betrayed her. The other whispered something behind her gloved hand. Arabella smiled, not because she was calm, but because that was what one did when the world tilted. "Shall we return to the ballroom?" she said lightly to Caraway, calmly fixing her gloves. His face had gone pale. They'll think what they wish," she said, stepping past him without a backward glance. Chapter 2. The Morning Scandal. London, 1815. The morning after the ball, 3 days later. The scandal had ripened in whispers. What began as a single raised eyebrow was now a full bouquet of speculation, passed from parlour to parlour with the enthusiasm usually reserved for royal births and fallen soufflés. Arabella had not left the house in 3 days. She hadn't been confined, technically, but the invitations had slowed, and her mother's sighs had become a near constant refrain. The toast was cold. Arabella bit into it anyway, calmly, deliberately. Across the table, her father's teacup rattled against its saucer. He did not speak. He had not spoken since he sat down. The table was laid as though nothing at all had happened. A silver rack of toast, untouched. A dish of poached eggs cooling beside thin slices of ham. A domed platter of kippers steamed faintly in the morning light, its lid slightly ajar. 2 crystal dishes held preserves, 1 strawberry, 1 blackcurrant, glinting like jewelled blood. A footman poured fresh tea into Lady Honoria's cup. She ignored it. "Lord Caraway has offered for you," she said, each word sharp as cut glass. "You may yet salvage your name, if not your reputation." Arabella chewed, swallowed. How generous of him. Honoria's hand curled into a fist over her linen napkin. She was dressed in mourning lace, not for a funeral, but for the death of her daughter's respectability. The black veil at her throat fluttered each time she exhaled through flared nostrils. "He is prepared to marry you and repair the damage. You ought to be grateful." Arabella reached for another slice of bread, spread it with butter and a little blackcurrant jam, and bit into it with deliberate elegance. "I would rather be ruined," she said, "than spend my life married to a man who smells of bergamot and boredom." Her father flinched. Lady Honoria rose so abruptly that her chair scraped against the polished floor. "Then ruined you shall be." She began to pace. "The entire room saw you with him. You were alone. The Marchioness's library, of all places. There are already whispers. At Lady Davenhall's table, at Lady Smythe's tea, even the Duchess's modiste has spoken of it. The modiste Arabella. How long do you suppose it will take before your name is passed through every drawing-room in Mayfair?" Arabella lifted her teacup and took a long, unhurried sip as though they were speaking of someone else entirely. "Let them whisper," she said. "I've never required their approval." "You find this amusing?" Honoria's voice rose. "You've no notion what you've done." "On the contrary," Arabella said. "I declined the most uninspiring proposal in Christendom and gave your friends something to discuss besides embroidery and gout. Frankly, you should be thanking me." "You will go to Redbridge Hall today," her mother said, her voice brittle with fury. "You will remain there with your uncle until the season has ended, and you will pray this gossip does not follow you into the next." A footman hovered at the doorway, eyes wide. Arabella caught his glance and smiled sweetly, as though they were only discussing the weather. "Do try to pack sensibly," her mother added. "Your uncle will not tolerate one of your ridiculous silk peignoirs at breakfast." Arabella rose. Her father still had not spoken. He regarded his toast as though it might offer him an escape. "I shall take only what I need," she said, "which means I shall be travelling light." She left the breakfast room with the air of a queen in exile. In her bedchamber, the morning light spilled across ivory wallpaper and the mirrored dressing table, where her maid, Elsie, waited beside an open trunk. "I heard," Elsie said quietly, folding a chemise. "I imagine most of London has," Arabella replied. She crossed to the wardrobe and ran a hand along the rows of gowns within. Pale pinks, soft greens, sky blues, the colours of innocence and obedience, the colours she had been told to wear. She chose the storm blue travelling cloak, the one with the silver buttons and velvet lining, the one her mother despised, not for its shade, but for its origin. It had been a gift from her father's sister, the wild aunt in Derbyshire who had married scandalously for love and taught Arabella to ride astride. The cloak had been sewn by hand, shaped for Arabella's form rather than the latest fashion. It bore no lace, no frills, no embroidery. Only clean lines, fine cloth, and freedom stitched into every seam. Lady Honoria had called it provincial. Arabella had never loved a garment more. "How long will you be gone?" Elsie asked. "That depends on how long the torn takes to forget me." Elsie hesitated, then offered a small silver ring. "You left this by the basin." Arabella took it, her grandmother's ring, and slipped it onto her finger. Something old. Something honest. "Thank you," she said, more gently than usual. "You've always been kind to me." Elsie curtsied, her eyes glimmering with questions left unasked. Arabella swept from the room without answering a single one. Elsie followed, her steps quiet but steady, the first of many she would take in exile with her mistress. The departure. The carriage stood waiting, polished and sombre, flanked by a pair of footmen who looked everywhere but at her. Lady Honoria stood at the base of the steps, her hands clasped, her lips pressed thin. Arabella did not curtsy. She did not kiss her cheek. She simply inclined her head. Her father stood in the shadow of the doorway. "You've made things difficult," he said, his gaze fixed on the stone at her feet. Arabella regarded him for a moment, just long enough for silence to say what words never could. "Then we are even," she said softly. She climbed into the carriage. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud. As the wheels began to turn and the streets of Mayfair slipped away, Arabella watched the city blur past the window. Spires and domes faded into grey. The fog was lifting, but the morning still carried that peculiar London chill, fresh, bitter, and full of things left unsaid. She leaned back against the velvet cushion and closed her eyes. Let them whisper. She had never needed their approval. Chapter 3. Redbridge Hall. Redbridge, Sussex, 2 days later. The sky was the colour of old pewter when Arabella's carriage turned through the moss-covered gates of Redbridge Hall. The estate rose from the mist like something half forgotten. Ivy-draped stone walls, a tall roofline tangled with chimney pots, and narrow leaded glass windows that watched her like old eyes. A row of clipped yews stood like silent sentries along the gravel drive, which was half mud from last night's rain. Arabella leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed. "Charming," she murmured. Beside her, Elsie shifted with the movement of the carriage and peeked out the opposite window. "Doesn't look like anyone's waiting," she said. "Do you think your uncle knows you're coming?" Arabella smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure he knows. He simply doesn't care." The wheels crunched to a stop before the stone steps. No footman rushed to open the door. No steward stood ready with a bow. Arabella opened the carriage door herself, stepped down into the bracing country air, and immediately sank half an inch into damp gravel. Wind teased the hem of her storm-blue cloak, now dulled by travel and road dust. She drew it tighter around her. From the stables came the sharp call of a groom and the clatter of hooves. 2 dogs barked somewhere in the distance, and then she saw him. A man strode from the stable yard, sleeves rolled to his forearms, boots caked in mud, jaw dusted with dark stubble. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like someone accustomed to physical labour, but there was control in the way he moved, the kind that didn't waste energy on anything unnecessary. His hair was dark, a little long, wind-tossed and stubborn. His eyes, grey, sharp and unreadable, landed on Arabella with a quiet, assessing look. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was something about the angles of his face, the shape of his mouth, the steady weight of his gaze that made her pause. He looked like the kind of man who didn't speak unless it mattered, and never said what you hoped. He didn't bow. He didn't speak. Arabella raised her chin. "And you are?" He looked at her, then at the carriage, and back again. "I might ask you the same." "Lady Arabella Greystone. I was expected." "Were you?" he said, as if the word left a bad taste. He took a long, unconcerned look at her cloak, her boots, her expression. Then he turned his head and gave a sharp whistle. A boy came running from the stable yard. "Take the reins," Wolfe ordered, nodding toward the carriage. "See that the horses are watered." The boy scrambled up, clearly accustomed to such commands. Wolfe turned back to Arabella and gestured, almost grudgingly, toward the stone steps. "Shall we?" She moved with him toward the threshold, boots crunching over gravel. Elsie followed with a case in each hand. "And you are?" Arabella asked again, her voice cool. "Wolfe," he said. "I look after the horses. Sometimes the house when your uncle forgets." She arched a brow. A stable master with opinions. How modern. He stepped closer. Not enough to be inappropriate, but enough to let her smell leather, hay, and something harder beneath. A lady who arrives without notice and expects trumpets. Arabella smiled, slow and razor-edged. Trumpets would be vulgar. I was hoping for at least a door held open. Wolfe didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted. Acknowledgement, maybe, or warning. "I'll tell the housekeeper you're here," he said. "Don't expect her to be pleased. She's been polishing silver for 3 days, and now you've tracked mud across the threshold." He stepped up ahead of her and pulled the great oak door open with a single hand. No flourish, just duty. Arabella crossed the threshold without hesitation. She didn't thank him. Inside, Redbridge Hall smelled of stone and beeswax and centuries-old secrets. Arabella was shown to a guest chamber with a low ceiling and a window that overlooked the moor. The fire was unlit. A jug of lukewarm water waited by the wash-basin. Elsie set down the case and began unpacking in silence. "Don't look at me like that," Arabella said, loosening her cloak. "I wasn't rude." "You were," Elsie said softly, "but only because he was first." Arabella glanced toward the window. Fog coiled just beyond the glass, soft and heavy. Somewhere down in the stables she imagined Sebastian Wolfe brushing down a stallion with hands far too calloused to be polite. She turned back toward the bed and sat. "Well," she said, "at least it won't be boring." Later that evening. Dinner at Redbridge was held in a long, echoing dining hall with only one candle lit at each end of the table. Arabella sat across from her uncle, Mr. Miles Greystone, who was also the vicar of the Redbridge parish, though he'd long since abandoned the vicarage in favour of the family house, which had better chimneys and fewer rats. He ate his meal like a man conducting a private war with overcooked vegetables. "I hope your room is tolerable," he said, after several minutes of silence. Arabella looked up from her trencher of cold mutton. "It has a ceiling and a window. I consider myself fortunate." He cleared his throat. "We've been short-staffed since Mrs. Cotterill's back gave out, and, well, cook does her best." Arabella peered into her bowl. "May I ask what this is meant to be?" "Currant pudding," her uncle replied, "though I suspect more suet than currant." She lifted an eyebrow. Charming. He gave a rare, dry smile. Dessert wasn't something Cook troubled herself with before Wolfe took it upon himself to interfere. Arabella lifted her brows. "So he's your steward, stable master, and now your culinary enforcer." "Something like that," her uncle muttered. The meal was nearly finished when a door creaked open near the back of the hall. Not the grand entry, but the narrow one that led to the kitchens. Sebastian Wolfe stepped through, sleeves rolled down, hair still damp at the temples, as if he'd only just finished washing. Arabella noticed the details instinctively, the direction he came from, the quiet way he moved, the fact that he did not greet her, or sit. He spoke only to the vicar, voice low and to the point. "The gate on the south field's still dragging. I'll see to it tomorrow." Mr. Greystone nodded. "Thank you." Wolfe's eyes flicked briefly toward Arabella, not rudely, but without deference. Then he turned and left the way he came. She said nothing, but she noticed how he came and went without ceremony, as though the room was never meant to hold him. When he was gone, the room felt flatter. Chapter 4. The Stable Bargain. It was either ride or go mad. After 3 days of polite breakfasts, long silences and muddy garden paths, Arabella had reached her limit. If she was to be exiled to the countryside like a parlour ornament, then she would at least do it from the back of a decent horse. She dressed with purpose, selecting a gown of pale blue silk with a fitted bodice, delicate pearl buttons, and embroidery at the hem that whispered of a Mayfair modiste. Elsie gave her a sidelong glance as she adjusted the drape of Arabella's cloak. "That's a great deal of embroidery for mud and hay." Arabella slipped on her gloves. "If I must visit a man in a barn, I'll do it beautifully." The walk to the stables was muddier than she liked. Redbridge's gravel drive had surrendered to puddles, and she took care to keep her hem above the worst of it, though the effort quickly grew tiresome. By the time she reached the stable yard, her patience had thinned considerably. Sebastian was already there, sleeves rolled and hands full, as always. He was brushing down a dark gelding with a firm, rhythmic motion, his coat slung carelessly over a post nearby. He didn't look up when she arrived, just said, evenly, "That's a fine dress, for tea, not for manure." Arabella narrowed her eyes. How fortunate the horses don't judge attire. Now he looked up. His gaze swept her from bonnet to boots, not lingering, but not hurried either. "They bite silk, you know." She ignored the comment and stepped closer. "I've come to choose a horse. If I'm to remain here, I intend to ride." "Is that so?" he said, turning back to the gelding. "And what exactly are you looking for, my lady?" "Something even-tempered, fast enough to make the hills interesting, but not so spirited I'm tossed within the first mile." Wolfe gave the horse an affectionate pat and moved toward another stall. "Then you'd best come meet them. They won't care what you're wearing." She followed him down the stable row, trying not to let her boots stick in the straw. The air smelled of hay and leather and horses, clean, but pungent. Her dress was too fine, and she knew it, but retreat was worse than discomfort. He introduced her to a few candidates, a chestnut gelding with a nervous gait, a dappled grey who shied at his own shadow. She tried to keep her gloves clean as she reached to stroke a muzzle, but the horse startled at the movement. She stepped back too quickly, lost her footing in the damp straw, and caught herself on the wooden rail. Hard. As she straightened, something tugged sharply at her skirts. She glanced down. The hem of her gown had caught on a nail protruding from the edge of the post. There was a distinct ripping sound. Arabella closed her eyes. When she opened them, Sebastian was watching her with maddening calm. "Do you require rescuing?" he asked. "Or shall I let you preserve your pride?" "I've recovered from worse," she said, lifting her chin and trying not to examine the state of her hem. A moment passed, one of those silences full of things unspoken. Then Sebastian turned and opened a stall near the far end. "This one," he said. "She's even-tempered," Sebastian continued. "Not fond of noise, prefers firm hands, clear direction." Arabella stepped closer. The mare let her approach without flinching. She stroked its neck gently, her hand brushing Sebastian's for the briefest instant. "She's beautiful," she murmured. "She's particular," he said, "but reliable." Arabella turned her gaze on him then, more carefully this time, and discerned a change in his expression. It was not softness she saw, but a keen attentiveness, thoughtfulness, carefully concealed. The moment passed. She stepped back, smoothing her gloves. "I'll ride her in the morning." Sebastian gave a slight nod. "I'll have her ready." Arabella turned to leave, her skirt torn at the hem, the edge of her cloak dusted with straw. She did not look back, but she knew he was watching her go. Chapter 5. A Steady Hand. Arabella arrived at the stables just after sunrise. The air was still and blue-edged, mist rising off the fields like breath upon glass. She wore a proper riding habit this time. Dark wool, high-necked, fastened with mother-of-pearl buttons and trimmed with a velvet collar. Sensible, certainly, yet flattering too. Elsie merely arched a brow as she assisted with the gloves. "So you have not entirely forgotten what mud is?" "I thought I should meet it mounted today," Arabella replied, and departed without further comment. The stable-yard lay quiet, save for the muffled clatter of hooves and the soft snort of a horse's breath. A stable boy, no more than 13, cast her a wide-eyed glance before hastening out of her path. The bay mare waited near the post, already saddled. Sebastian stood beside her. He did not greet Arabella. He glanced up, inclined his head once, and returned to adjusting the mare's bridle. Arabella watched him for a moment. He was in shirt-sleeves again, as though the morning chill held no authority over him. His dark hair was still damp at the edges, as if he had washed in haste before coming out. He moved with quiet efficiency. No wasted motion, no uncertainty. Only work and strength and a steady silence. He was not handsome in the manner she had been taught to admire. Not polished, yet there was a solidity to him, a sense of weight and balance. The sort of man who would not lose his head in a storm, nor bow merely because another possessed more coin or consequence. She lifted her chin as she approached. Sebastian gave the girth strap a final check, then stepped back. "She is ready." "I am not helpless," Arabella said, taking the reins. "I can mount without assistance." "You are welcome to attempt it." The words were not unkind, only plain. So she did attempt it, and very nearly succeeded. But the stirrup sat a touch too high, the skirts proved awkward, and she faltered. The side saddle was not new, though it was well cared for, clearly tended with attention. Arabella placed a gloved hand upon the pommel and hesitated. Mounting had always felt more like performance than sport. Sebastian stepped forward without a word and offered his hand. Arabella paused, only for the briefest breath, then took it. His grip was firm and steady, and with a smooth, practiced motion, He guided her upward. His hand brushed her ankle fleetingly through the fabric of her skirt. Not deliberate, not improper. Yet she felt it all the same. He stepped back at once. Keep her nose to the wind. She'll be inclined to run. Arabella gathered the reins. A temptation few of us resist, she murmured. She rode out without further word, guiding the mare down a narrow track that curved through the orchard. The world felt hushed. No carriages, no voices, no claims upon her attention. Only the sound of hooves, the rhythm of breath, and her own pulse quickening with every stride. When the mare lengthened into a canter, Arabella let her go, loosening the reins with a light hand. The wind tugged at her cloak and loosened a curl from beneath her bonnet. She laughed, brief, unguarded, exhilarated. It was not a London laugh. There was nothing rehearsed in it. When she slowed near a low stone wall at the edge of the pasture, she became aware that she was no longer alone. Sebastian sat several fields behind, mounted on a tall bay gelding, watching her with an expression she could not readily decipher. He had not followed closely, only near enough to be certain she would not come to harm. She said nothing, but she noted it. Turning her mount, she rode back toward him. They met at the gate. Sebastian dismounted and crossed to her side, reaching up, silent once more, to assist her down. She did not require the help. She accepted it nonetheless. This time, their hands lingered a fraction longer than necessary. "She suits you," Sebastian said quietly, once she stood upon the ground. Arabella smoothed her gloves. So does the countryside, when it is not determined to dull one's senses entirely. The corner of his mouth very nearly curved. "You do not sit still easily, do you?" Arabella narrowed her eyes. "Is that meant as a criticism?" "Merely an observation." She glanced at him, coolly. "Then allow me one in return. I do not care to be observed." They led the horses back in silence, side by side. The stable boy reappeared to take the reins, glancing between them with undisguised curiosity before retreating into the yard. Sebastian began to unsaddle the mare. Arabella lingered. "Perhaps I shall ride again tomorrow," she said lightly. "She will be ready," he said. There was a pause. Then, without lifting his gaze, he added, "You rode well." Arabella did not answer. But as she turned away, a small smile touched her mouth, quiet and unmistakable. Chapter 6. A Lesson in Control. Redbridge Hall, Sussex, the following morning. The stables smelled of oats, leather and earth when Arabella arrived just past 9. The air was sharper than the day before, the wind cutting across the paddocks and carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and frost-bitten grass. This time she came prepared. Her riding habit was a deep forest green, tailored to the line of her figure without being fussy. Her boots were polished but practical. Her hair was coiled and pinned with care, tucked beneath a dark velvet riding hat. She looked, Sebastian would later admit to himself, exactly like a woman who knew how to ride and wanted everyone to know it. He didn't greet her when she arrived. He was in the tack room, tightening a girth strap and inspecting a bit of frayed leather. But he noticed her. Of course he did. Arabella stood just inside the stable yard, one gloved hand resting on her hip, watching him work, calm, composed, and entirely unimpressed. "You're late," he said, not bothering to look up. "You didn't give me a time." "I assumed you were clever enough to find morning." "I am. I simply prefer mornings that begin with civility and toast." He emerged from the tack room with the mare already saddled. "Your uncle asked me to make sure everything goes smoothly, with the mare specifically," he said, offering the reins. Arabella took them with a slow lift of her brow. "Naturally." She placed her boot in the stirrup and swung up neatly into the side saddle, settling her skirts with practiced ease. Sebastian reached for the reins again, adjusting how they lay in her fingers, and then, without asking, shifted her right hand ever so slightly. His fingers brushed hers. She felt it like heat, even through the glove. "You're holding too high," he said. "You'll lose control on a slope." Arabella lifted a brow. "And here I thought I was merely decorative." Sebastian's mouth twitched, just slightly. "Try to remember. You're not in Hyde Park. These hills have teeth." Noted. He mounted his own horse, a tall chestnut gelding, and they set off at a steady pace, trotting through the lower pasture and into the rolling fields beyond. The sun hung low but bright above the ridge, casting pale gold through the mist. They didn't speak much at first. The silence was companionable, broken only by the thud of hooves and the whisper of wind through the hedgerows. Arabella rode well, better than she'd implied, and Sebastian watched her from the corner of his eye, impressed despite himself. At the top of the ridge, she turned to him, eyes bright with wind and morning. "Shall we see what she can do?" He gave her a look. "This isn't Rotten Row." "No, it's better." And with that, she nudged the mare forward and shot ahead, laughing as the horse surged beneath her. Sebastian followed. They galloped across the open field, her cloak streaming behind her like a pennant. Cold air stung their cheeks, the ground flew beneath them, and for a moment there was nothing but speed. She reached the far fence a breath before he did. When they slowed to a walk, both breathing harder than they let on, Arabella flashed him a grin. "You let me win." He raised an eyebrow. "You're still upright. That was my priority." They dismounted at the paddock gate. Arabella stumbled slightly as her boot met uneven ground, and Sebastian caught her by the elbow. His hand lingered just a moment too long. She didn't pull away. "Your uncle wouldn't thank me if you broke your neck," he said, releasing her. "And yet, I suspect you'd find it inconvenient too." He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should have. She adjusted her gloves, lips curving. "You're not nearly as grim as you pretend to be, Mr. Wolfe." "I'm not pretending," he said. That made her laugh, a quiet, delighted sound. He handed the reins to the stable boy without another word. That evening, Arabella passed the drawing room on her way to fetch a shawl and paused when she heard her name. Her uncle's voice, low and tired. "I asked you to ride out with her, not grow familiar. She's a guest, Wolfe, not one of the horses. You'll need to keep your distance." Sebastian's reply was quiet, too quiet to hear. Arabella didn't move, not for a long moment. From the corner of the room, Sebastian glanced toward the open doorway, just once, briefly, before returning his gaze to the fire. Then she turned on her heel and walked the other way. Chapter 7. Unspoken Things. Redbridge Hall, Sussex, the next day. It rained all morning, not the gentle sort that kissed windows and softened gardens, but a relentless, wind-driven storm that lashed the panes and turned the gravel paths to soup. The moors beyond the house vanished entirely, veiled by rolling fog and silver sheets of rain. Arabella did not go to the stables. She remained in her room after breakfast, curled in a high-backed chair near the hearth, pretending to read while the fire hissed and spat. The book in her lap lay open to a page she hadn't turned in half an hour. Elsie came and went, keeping herself busy, folding, dusting, muttering about drafts. At one point, she paused, glancing at the untouched tea, the book that hadn't moved, the eyes that weren't reading. She turned toward the window and said, almost casually, "He's out in that, you know." Arabella didn't look up. Good for him. Elsie raised a brow, but said nothing more. By midday, a knock came at the front door, rare enough to make the whole house flinch. The postboy stood on the steps, coat dripping, cheeks flushed from the cold. Arabella was summoned to the entry by the housekeeper, who handed her a small bundle of letters bound in twine. Only one bore her name. The handwriting was familiar, precise, perfumed, and just a little smug. Lady Dalton. Arabella returned to her room and opened it beside the fire. The wax seal cracked clean in two. My dearest Arabella, London is, of course, dreary without you, though there is talk enough to keep us warm. Lord C has been seen at White's, drinking and sulking. He still defends your honour in his fashion, though his moods grow tiresome. People forget quickly, but they do love to remember when reminded. If I were you, I would stay put. Let the weather pass. Yours as ever, reliably informed, Miranda. Arabella folded the letter carefully and set it aside without expression. That afternoon, she joined her uncle for tea in the withdrawing room. The fire had been lit early, and the scent of damp wool and bergamot filled the space. He poured without asking her preference and handed her the cup with a slight bow of his head. They drank in silence. After a time, her uncle cleared his throat. I imagine you missed the season. Arabella sipped. Not especially. No assemblies, no callers, no champagne, he asked. She allowed the faintest smile. I've never been particularly fond of champagne. He nodded. There is peace here. Not the kind you're accustomed to, I dare say. Arabella looked toward the window. Rain streamed down the glass in thin, crooked rivulets. It's not peace that bothers me, she said. It's silence. She left the room shortly after and climbed the stairs, intending to retrieve her shawl. As she rounded the landing, she nearly collided with Sebastian. He was coming down the corridor, boots muddy, shirt damp at the collar, clearly just returned from the stables. He stopped short. They stared at each other in that narrow, quiet space. She was the first to speak. Shouldn't you be tying down roofs or rescuing livestock? His tone was even. I've done both already. The stable roof's leaking. A beam gave way near the north stall. Very rustic, she said, brushing past him. How fortunate that you manage it all so well. He didn't move aside. Avoiding me won't fix anything. She stopped, mid-step. Avoiding you. Sebastian's voice remained low. You heard your uncle. I'm to keep my distance. Arabella turned to face him. And so you've decided to become a shadow instead? I've always been a shadow, Lady Arabella. It's only now you've noticed. A beat passed. She looked at him then, fully. Rain clung to the dark strands of his hair, curled slightly at the ends. His eyes, always unreadable, seemed darker in the dim corridor light. Everyone keeps their distance. You're just the only one honest about it. Then she walked away. That night, the rain did not stop. If anything, it thickened, beating against the windows as though it meant to find a way inside. Arabella lay in bed, awake. The fire had burned low. Lady Dalton's letter rested on the table beside her, folded once, then again. The broken wax seal sat near the candle holder, melted just enough to shine. She stared at the ceiling. She thought of Sebastian's hands, steady on the reins, gentle when he caught her, distant when he let her go. As though it had cost him nothing. She closed her eyes. Sleep did not come. Chapter 8. The Price of Stillness. Redbridge Hall, Sussex, the morning after the storm. The silence woke her. No thunder, no wind rattling the windows, no heavy rain drumming across the roof tiles. Just the soft, uncanny quiet of a morning trying to decide whether to dawn. Arabella sat up slowly. The air had a bite to it. Her fire had gone cold in the night. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and padded across the wooden floor to peer out the window. The world beyond was pale grey and sodden. The moor rippled with low mist. Trees stood crooked against the horizon, their limbs heavy and glistening. She dressed in silence. By the time she reached the breakfast room, Elsie was already there, spreading butter onto a heel of brown bread and eyeing a pot of tea that looked over-stewed. "No sign of Mr. Wolfe this morning," she said. Arabella arched a brow. "How industrious." "Left before dawn," Elsie replied, pouring the tea with more hope than trust. "Didn't say where. Perhaps he's hiding from the pudding." Elsie smiled faintly. "Or perhaps he's fixing whatever the storm pulled apart." An hour later, her uncle appeared in the hall with wet boots and a mud-spattered coat. He looked at her over his spectacles, surprised to see her loitering near the windows. "You're up early," he said. "It's 9:30. For you, that's practically sunrise." He began peeling off his gloves. "Wolfe's gone up the northern fence line. The old oak split, nearly flattened the stable wall." Arabella hesitated. "And no one else went?" "No one else could lift the branch." Her uncle gave her a glance she couldn't quite read. "He never rests, you know. He doesn't know how." Later that morning, Arabella made it halfway to the stables before turning down the hill instead. The path was thick with mud. Her boots squelched with every step. Her cloak, too fine for this walk, was soon flecked with bramble and leaf. But she kept going. Sebastian was precisely where he was said to be. Knee-deep in sodden earth, stripped to shirt sleeves, dragging a fallen limb away from the fence line. His coat was slung over a rock. His hands were wrapped in thick rope. A small axe sat buried in a log behind him. She stopped a short distance away. He didn't hear her approach. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to show it. "I've never seen someone look so personally offended by a tree," she said at last. Sebastian glanced up. His face was flushed from exertion, hair damp at the nape, brow furrowed beneath the weight of effort, or something heavier. "I told your uncle I'd repair the fence." "Yes, but I doubt he demanded it be done alone, or immediately." "I like to be thorough," he said. Arabella stepped closer, surveying the damage. The tree had fallen across 2 fence posts, now bent or splintered. The limb was massive, slick with moss and rain. She nodded toward the rope. "You're going to shift that by yourself?" "I've done worse." "You're impossible." "I've been called worse." She paused, then stepped carefully around the broken fence. "Let me help." Sebastian gave her a look. "You're wearing silk-lined gloves." "Not anymore." She pulled them off. "Now they're just silk." He said nothing as she moved to the other end of the branch and crouched beside him, bracing her weight. For a moment, all that could be heard was the squelch of mud, the creak of strained rope, the slow, breathless work of 2 people doing something that should have taken 3. When the limb finally rolled free, it landed with a sodden thump beside the fence. Arabella fell back onto the grass, chest heaving. Sebastian didn't sit. He didn't stretch. He just looked at her. "You're stubborn." "You're a terrible host." His mouth almost twitched. After a long pause, she said more quietly, "Why do you really stay here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the post where the axe was buried and leaned against it, brushing a hand through his hair. "I served in the cavalry," he said at last. "After the war, there wasn't much left that suited me. Your uncle found me in London, working where I shouldn't have been." "And he brought you here?" "He offered a post and a place where no one asked questions. I took both." Arabella sat forward, clasping her knees. "And has it helped?" "I haven't killed anyone since," he said dryly. She laughed. soft, startled. Then, after a pause, "He hoped I'd find peace. I found space." "That's not the same," she said. Sebastian looked at her. "And is that enough?" "No," she said, "but I've found clarity." She rose to her feet. He stepped closer, perhaps without meaning to. They stood on either side of the repaired fence post, hands brushing against the rough wood at the same time. Her fingers touched his, just briefly. He held still. "You shouldn't be out here," he said at last, voice low. "And you shouldn't be here with me." Arabella didn't flinch. "And yet I am." The wind caught her cloak. Neither of them moved. Stillness, it turned out, had its own weight. Chapter 9. The Harvest Ball. Redbridge Parish Hall, Sussex, 2 weeks later. The scent of beeswax and roasted apples clung to the walls of the parish hall, mingling with music, laughter, and the faint perfume of late autumn roses. The harvest ball had been held for generations. It was neither as grand as the events Arabella had once attended in London, nor as humble as she'd expected. Candles flickered in every window. Evergreen garlands hung above the musicians' platform. The tables were heavy with glazed pies and silver bowls of trifle, clotted cream glistening beside heaps of stewed berries. Her uncle had attended, of course. Clergymen were expected at such things. But he had made his rounds early, offered his blessings, and quietly retired before the dancing began in earnest. "He knows when to leave people to themselves," Elsie had murmured, with something like approval. Arabella stood near the hearth, a glass of cordial in hand, her sapphire silk gown catching the firelight like midnight waves. Her hair was pinned in soft coils, threaded through with mother-of-pearl combs that shimmered when she turned her head. The local heir, Viscount Greaves, approached her before the first dance. He was freshly barbered and overdressed in pale green satin, with a cravat so elaborate it might have required an architect. "Lady Arabella," he said with a bow, "would you do me the honour?" Arabella hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then offered him a composed smile. "Of course." The reel was mercifully short. Greaves had all the grace of a spinning chair leg and twice the smugness. He spoke of horses and hunting and some inheritance dispute involving a cousin in Kent. Arabella nodded at the right moments, smiled politely, and managed not to roll her eyes. When the music ended, he bowed again and looked as though he might ask for another. She offered a gentle final nod and turned away before he could speak. She moved back toward the hearth, her cordial untouched. And that's when she felt it. Not because he announced himself, he never would, but because the air changed. People shifted, heads turned. And across the hall, in the space between laughter and music, Sebastian appeared. In black. His coat was well cut, though not fashionable. No frills, no lace, no satin sheen. Just dark wool, a pressed cravat, and that impossibly steady gaze. Her pulse tripped. "One might almost mistake him for a gentleman," Elsie murmured, as she passed with a platter of game pie, offering Arabella a sideways glance. Arabella didn't answer. She wasn't sure if she agreed, or if she dared to. Sebastian moved through the crowd without hesitation, never breaking his gaze. He didn't bow, he didn't smile. "Dance with me," he said. Arabella blinked. "I didn't think you danced." "I do." She set her glass aside. "Don't step on me." He offered his hand. She took it, knowing she shouldn't. The dance began, another country reel, light and fast. It should have been nothing, steps memorized in childhood, music that asked for laughter more than grace. But it wasn't nothing. His hand at her waist wasn't nothing. The heat of his palm through her glove wasn't nothing. And when they turned, when they came together again and again through the figures of the dance, Arabella could feel the way he watched her. Not just looked, but watched, as if memorizing the weight and shape of her. "You're being observed," she murmured between steps. "I noticed. Do you care?" He met her gaze. "Should I?" She smiled faintly. "I haven't decided yet." A flicker of something passed between them, heat, amusement, something deeper. "Let me know when you do," he said. The dance ended with a final spin and a breathless pause. Applause scattered through the room. Arabella stepped back, her chest rising and falling too fast for a mere reel. Across the floor, Viscount Greaves was still watching. "Why is he glaring at you like that?" Sebastian asked under his breath. "Because I danced with him." She gave a slight shrug. Once was quite enough. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He took it for encouragement. "And was it?" he asked. Arabella met his eyes, not even slightly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of warm cider, flickering candles, and music spun in slow, winding ribbons. Sebastian did not ask her to dance again. But he remained nearby, silent, watchful, never far. Arabella, though she laughed when laughter was expected and smiled when spoken to, felt it rising in her like a tide. The glances, the whispers, the sense that every step was being measured against some invisible scale of womanhood and worth. She needed air. Without a word, she turned from the crowd and slipped through the side door, into the quiet dark beyond the hall. And Sebastian, though he said nothing, he didn't ask, he simply followed. Chapter 10. Lips and Lies. Redbridge Parish Hall, stable yard, interior of the stable. The night air met her skin like a confession. Arabella stepped into the dark, the muffled music of the harvest ball fading behind her. Gravel crunched beneath her boots. The silence outside was not true silence. It held the rustle of wind, the distant creak of old trees, and the sharp, uneven beat of her own heart. She didn't know where she was going. Only that she had to leave. Inside, the room had pressed too close. The eyes had been too sharp. Wolfe, Sebastian, too near. The memory of his hand at her waist still lingered, warm and insistent. And Greaves, always Greaves, watching her like a man inspecting a prize. She passed the hedge, the garden gate, and followed the worn path toward the stable, guided more by instinct than reason. Her skirt caught briefly on a low branch. Her breath misted white in the chill air. Inside, the scent of hay and horses wrapped around her, earthy, honest, oddly kind. And then, a door creaked behind her. She turned. Sebastian stood just inside, his coat unbuttoned, shirt collar slightly loosened. He said nothing. His eyes, unreadable in the low light, held hers without hesitation. "You followed me," she said, aiming for lightness. It came out hoarse. "I did." She crossed her arms. "That's hardly proper." "No," he agreed. "Neither was our dance." She turned away, resting her gloved hands against a wooden beam. "Is that what they're saying?" He nodded once. "I knew what it would mean." She looked at him then, over her shoulder. "You danced like it meant something." He stepped closer. "And you, like a woman trying to forget." Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. She turned fully. They stood a breath apart. The lantern above flickered, casting warm gold across the curve of her cheek and the hard line of his jaw. "You shouldn't be here," she breathed. "I know," he replied. "You shouldn't look at me like that." "I know that too," he said. Arabella whispered, "Then why—" He kissed her. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a hesitation. It was truth, raw and dangerous and warm. His hand found her waist, her fingers tangled in the folds of his coat. For one long, breathless moment, the rest of the world fell away. He was the first to pull back, only just. His breath was unsteady. I shouldn't have done that. No, she said. He looked at her, not with hunger, but something closer to sorrow, something quieter, something that hurt more. You deserve better, he said softly. Then he stepped back. Arabella didn't follow. She stayed where she was, the heat of his touch fading like the echo of music through a closed door. She listened as his footsteps retreated across the stable floor, each one a little softer than the last. Chapter 11. The Morning After. Redbridge Hall, the following morning. The fire had gone out in her room. Arabella lay awake in the half-light of dawn, her eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling above her. Her hands rested on her stomach, fingers curled as though still holding something that was no longer there. The kiss clung to her mouth like something unfinished. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even undressed. Somewhere beneath the wool coverlet, her ball gown had creased into strange folds. Her pearl combs still sat on the washstand, forgotten. One slipper lay overturned beneath the chair, as though it too had left in haste. It had not been a dream. Sebastian Wolfe had kissed her, and she had kissed him back. She closed her eyes, only briefly, and saw again the flicker of lantern light on his face, the weight of his hand at her waist, the moment he pulled away. She heard his voice again, low and steady. You deserve better. And still, he had kissed her like a man who wanted everything. In the breakfast room, the air smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. Her uncle sat behind a small fortress of teacups and a bowl of rubbery eggs, reading a week-old paper with pinched concentration. Elsie moved quietly through the room, setting out toast, jam and butter with more care than usual. Arabella sat at the table, silent. No one spoke of the ball, certainly not of who had left early, or who had followed, or what might have happened in the stables. Her uncle cleared his throat. The bishop's letter has arrived, he said. Arabella blinked. What bishop? The Bishop of Chichester, he replied. They're sending a curate. I'm to oversee him through Lent. Thrilling, Arabella said, reaching for the marmalade. I thought it might interest you, her uncle added mildly. You've always taken well to sermons about judgment. She gave him a pointed look. Elsie cleared her throat softly. Shall I lay out your wool habit this morning, my lady? Yes, Arabella said quietly. That will do. After breakfast, Arabella made her way to the stables. She didn't expect to see him, but he was there. Sebastian stood at the edge of the paddock, arms folded, sleeves rolled. He wasn't watching the horses. He was watching her. He didn't nod, didn't speak. He simply waited, like a question she hadn't answered yet. Arabella stopped a few paces away. I didn't expect to see you this morning, she said. I hoped you would, Sebastian replied. You kissed me. I did. You said I deserved better. I did. A breath passed between them, cool, fragile. Arabella's voice caught. Then why? Sebastian looked at her. There was no heat in his gaze now, only honesty. Because I don't want to want you, he said quietly. But I do. Arabella didn't move. I don't expect you to say anything, Sebastian added. I wasn't going to, Arabella said. Another pause. Then she stepped closer. Not much. Just enough to prove she hadn't run. Is my horse ready? She asked, her voice steady. Sebastian turned away. Without another word, he led the mare from her stall. He did not touch Arabella's hand when he passed her the reins, but his fingers brushed hers. Too quick to be an accident. Too careful to be more. Chapter 12. Visitors and Rumours. Redbridge Hall, later that week. The knock came just after noon, sharp, confident, and twice too loud for comfort. Arabella looked up from her embroidery. Elsie froze mid-stitch. Elsie murmured, "That's not the curate. That knock has better boots." Arabella set her work aside and crossed to the window. A fine barouche waited in the gravel drive, glossy and ostentatious in the pale winter sun. The Greaves family crest gleamed on the door. She exhaled through her nose. Arabella said, "It appears Viscount Greaves has found time for a social call." Elsie muttered something under her breath about vultures in cravats and disappeared to alert the housekeeper. The parlour had been hastily opened. The fire was sulky, the tea tepid, and the company worse. Greaves lounged in a chintz-covered armchair, posture easy, smile easier. Greaves said, "My mother sends her regards. She was quite disappointed not to speak with you at the ball." Arabella stirred her tea. Once, twice. Arabella said, "It was a crowded evening." Greaves replied, "Yet somehow I always saw you." She lifted an eyebrow. Arabella said, "An alarming gift." Greaves leaned forward. Greaves said, "Lady Arabella, let's speak plainly. You've been tucked away here for weeks. Tongues are beginning to wag." Arabella replied, "How bold of them." Greaves continued, "I'm not here to judge. I'm here to offer rescue." She set her cup down. Arabella said, "Pardon me." Greaves said, "You know what I mean. A proposal, a proper one. Your name restored, your future secured." She looked at him for a long moment, then rose. Arabella said softly, "I see, you imagine me grateful." Greaves blinked. "Well, yes." Arabella said, "Grateful for your mercy, for your gallantry, for the chance to become Lady Greaves and never again speak above a whisper unless spoken to." Greaves flushed. "It's a generous offer." Arabella said coolly, "No, it's a convenient one, for you." A pause. Then, Greaves snapped, "You'd rather wait for the stable master, is that it?" The words cracked like a whip. Arabella's eyes narrowed. Arabella said, "I see, now we're speaking plainly." Greaves stood abruptly. "You know what people are saying?" Arabella replied, "I do, and I know what you just said. Good day, my lord." He left in a huff of coattails and offended pride. Arabella remained standing until the sound of carriage wheels faded from the gravel. Elsie entered a moment later, bearing a fresh pot of tea. Elsie asked, "Well?" Arabella sat slowly. Arabella said, "He offered for me." Elsie paused. Elsie asked gently, "And?" Arabella replied, "I declined." Another beat of quiet. Elsie asked, "Was it the marriage, or the man?" Arabella reached for the new cup. Arabella said, "The answer is neither of your business." But her mouth twitched as she said it. Later that evening, Arabella passed through the hall and caught the sound of low voices near the open library door. Her uncle, and Sebastian. She hadn't meant to stop, but something in her name, spoken low, made her still. Her uncle was saying, "Too proud for her own good. But clever, and not blind, I think." Sebastian's voice came steady and quiet. "She's not, but neither am I." Her uncle replied, "You've been seen. Whispers are sharpening." Sebastian said, "I know." Her uncle pressed, "And yet you still—" Sebastian cut in, "I've kept my distance since the ball, sir." Arabella's breath caught. She turned and walked away, quietly, quickly. But the heat rose in her chest, and her thoughts refused to settle. He hadn't touched her, not since that night. And somehow, that was worse. Chapter 13. The Curate Arrives. Redbridge Parish, Sunday morning. The first frost of winter glittered on the chapel eaves as the congregation gathered, boots crunching on the gravel path and scarves drawn tight. Inside, the stone walls held the chill like memory, and the air smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. Arabella arrived late. Not by design, her gloves had gone missing, and Elsie insisted on brushing every speck of lint from her cloak, but the effect was the same. Half the parish had already turned to whisper by the time she slipped through the chapel doors. She met their stares with practiced grace, chin lifted, steps measured. She took her place in the greystone pew and folded her hands in her lap, pretending not to notice the subtle tilt of Viscount Greaves's head 2 rows ahead. At the front of the chapel, her uncle stood with one hand on the lectern, clearing his throat in that familiar way. Half patience, half command. But today, he wasn't alone. The curate stood beside him. He was young, barely older than Arabella, handsome in the polished, soft-featured way of a younger son raised for the pulpit, not the battlefield, trained for sermons, not swords. His hair was a mild brown, his expression earnest, his manner far too well rehearsed. Mr. Greystone said, "My friends, you'll have noticed we have a new voice among us. Mr. Thomas Ashbourne, newly appointed curate of Redbridge, begins his service this morning. I trust you'll welcome him kindly." Ashbourne bowed, his smile somehow both grateful and ambitious. His sermon, smooth, elegant, and faintly impersonal, was well received. Polite nods, murmurs of approval, the sort of speech that offends no one, and moves even less. Arabella's thoughts wandered. She studied the stained glass behind the pulpit, the way the light caught the dust, the way her fingertips felt colder than the rest of her. She was aware of Sebastian's absence, though she'd had no reason to expect him. He never came to church. And yet, after the service, the congregation spilled into the crisp morning light. Cloaks were drawn close, greetings exchanged, hands shaken. The new curate accepted praise with modesty and efficiency, especially from those with eligible daughters or idle estates. Arabella moved through the crowd slowly. Mr. Ashbourne's voice came beside her, smooth and confident. "Lady Arabella, may I walk with you?" She turned. Ashbourne offered another polished bow, a hopeful smile brightening his face. "I'm honoured to finally make your acquaintance," he said. "Your uncle speaks highly of your mind. Rare praise for a woman, I'm afraid, and not a compliment I offer lightly." Arabella arched a brow. Arabella replied, "Are you always so forward after a sermon?" Ashbourne grinned. "Only when it works." She allowed herself a small smile, then looked ahead. The lane curved gently toward Redbridge Hall. A gust of wind sent brittle leaves spiralling across the path. Ashbourne said after a pause, "You're not what I expected." Arabella replied, "Nor are you." He smiled. "Then perhaps we shall surprise each other." That afternoon, Sebastian did not appear. Not in the stables, not even in passing, not by accident. His absence felt deliberate, and worse, familiar. Arabella found herself noticing the shape of it, the quiet, the lack of hammering in the yard. Even the dogs seemed subdued. She retired early, too early. The house felt too large. In her chamber, Elsie folded linen with the precision of someone avoiding conversation. Elsie said at last, "That curate nearly tripped over his own cassock staring at you." Arabella looked up from her dressing table. Elsie smirked. "Not hard to guess who's in his prayers this week." Arabella turned back to the mirror. Arabella said, "He doesn't even know me." Elsie replied, "Men like him never let that stop them." Arabella stared at her own reflection, and for the first time in days, she thought of the kiss, not as a mistake, not as a scandal, but as a line, one she had crossed, and one Sebastian now seemed determined not to. Chapter 14. Cold Hands, Clear Eyes. Redbridge countryside, 3 days later. The morning frost clung to the hedgerows like lace. Arabella rode alone. Sebastian had not offered to accompany her, nor had she asked. The tension between them had settled into something brittle and silent. But still, he had saddled the mare. He always did. The cold bit through her gloves as she guided the horse up the long hill that overlooked the western fields. From here she could see all of Redbridge laid out in soft gold and pale slate. The chapel roof, the curl of smoke from the kitchen chimney, the faint gleam of the river in the distance. The wind stung her eyes, but she did not blink. She needed this, the quiet, the distance, the illusion, however fleeting, of control. At the crest of the hill, she dismounted. The ground was firm with frost, and her boots crunched through the grass as she led the mare along the fence line. A pair of pheasants startled from the underbrush and vanished into the trees. She paused, one hand resting on the mare's neck, steadying her own breath. Then, behind her, hooves. Arabella turned. Sebastian approached at a steady canter, his coat dark against the pale landscape, hair tousled by the wind. He slowed as he neared, dismounted without a word, and looked at her. Not unreadable this time, just quiet, watchful. She said nothing. Sebastian said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." Arabella replied, "I'm not supposed to do many things. I find the list tiresome." He regarded her for a beat, then gave a short nod. Fair. They walked in silence, the horses trailing behind. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. Left behind at the harvest ball, in the shadowed stable, sealed with a kiss neither of them had mentioned since. Sebastian said finally, "I heard you've a new admirer." Arabella gave a faint huff. "You heard, or you were told? Does it matter?" She met his gaze. "It matters if you're jealous." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "I'm not jealous." "Then what are you?" He didn't answer right away. "I'm cold," he said at last, "and tired of pretending I don't care what happens to you." The words landed low in her chest. Unexpected. Inevitable. She stepped closer. "Then stop pretending." He looked down at her gloved hands. "They're frozen. I'm not fragile." "I know," he said. He reached out slowly and took her hands in his. His skin was warm, rough with calluses. Her breath left her in a slow, careful exhale. Arabella said, "I'm not afraid of being seen with you." Sebastian said quietly, "You should be. This only ends one way." She didn't flinch. "Then let it end that way," she said. "But let it begin first." A breath passed between them, and then he kissed her. Not in secret, not in shadow, not behind the safety of doors or dusk, but here, in the cold, under the open sky. Chapter 15. The Vicar's Warning. Redbridge Hall that evening. The wind scoured the walls of Redbridge Hall as though it meant to peel the house apart, stone by stone. In the study, a fire popped and spat in the grate, fighting against the chill that seeped through old mortar and older regrets. Arabella sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm, eyes fixed on the flames. She hadn't intended to speak, but the weight of her thoughts had grown too loud to carry alone. Her uncle, seated across from her with a well-worn book resting unread in his lap, spoke first. "You've that look about you," he said, not unkindly. "The one your mother wore when she'd decided to confess something, but hadn't yet decided whether she regretted it." Arabella didn't smile. "I've developed a certain closeness to someone," she said carefully. The fire crackled in the study hearth. Her uncle sat across from her in his usual chair, a worn book resting unread in his lap. His voice, low and weathered, broke the silence. "You've that look about you," he said, not unkindly. "The one your mother wore when she'd decided to confess something, but hadn't yet decided whether she regretted it." Arabella didn't smile. "I've developed a certain closeness to someone," she said carefully. The flames shifted. The shadows danced. Her uncle asked, "A certain someone who works in my stables?" Her breath caught, just for a moment. "You knew." He gave a dry, familiar smile. "I'm a vicar, not blind." He set the book aside, folded his hands over his middle, and studied her with the weary fondness of a man who had seen too much and judged little. "Is it serious?" She hesitated. "It feels serious." Mr. Greystone exhaled slowly. "Then I suppose it is." She rose and crossed to the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the mantel. The fire warmed her gloves, but not her fingers. Her voice softened. "You trust him." "I do," he said without hesitation. "More than most men with better boots and finer manners." "But that doesn't mean you approve." He gave a quiet, tired smile. "Approval is a luxury for those who live without scandal. You and I gave that up long ago." She looked into the flames, then back at him. "What happens if I don't stop it?" "You'll be happy. For a time," he said. "Then you'll be tried by the world for having been bold enough to want it." She turned toward him, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw. "And if I do stop it, you'll regret it, quietly, for a long time." They stood in silence. Somewhere above, the house groaned under the pressure of the storm. The wind rattled a shutter down the corridor. Mr. Greystone picked up his book again, though he didn't open it. "Just know the cost, Arabella," he said gently, "and pay it with your eyes open." She nodded once, then turned and left. The hall was cold. Her shoes whispered against the old floorboards as she made her way toward the side vestibule. The portraits lining the corridor loomed in their stiff collars and powdered wigs, as though reminding her what a Greystone ought to do. Arabella didn't look at them. She found Sebastian by the door, pulling on his coat with tight, efficient movements. He didn't see her at first. His brow was furrowed, his mouth set. "I'm riding out," he said, when he finally noticed her. Tree down by the south field. Her fingers curled at her sides. "In this weather?" He glanced at the panelled window. "It'll be worse by morning," he said. Arabella stepped closer. "Let me come with you." "No," she lifted her chin. "I'm not delicate. This isn't about delicacy." "Then what is it about?" He hesitated. Sebastian said, "You've already been sent away once. I won't be the cause of it happening again." Arabella replied, "You weren't the cause. Not then. And not now." He shook his head. "That doesn't matter. The world won't care." She stepped closer. "Then let it talk. I'm not hiding." He looked away, jaw clenched. "You don't understand." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You don't. You kissed me, Sebastian, and now you're pretending it didn't happen." He met her gaze, hard. "I'm pretending it didn't matter." A beat passed. Her heart lurched, but she didn't flinch. "You kissed me like it mattered," she said. "And I know you. You don't waste breath on things you don't feel." He didn't respond. She reached for the door and pulled it open. The wind screamed through the gap and sent the candle flame writhing. "If you ride alone tonight," she said, voice low but steady, "then it's because you chose to. Not because I was afraid to come." She stepped into the wind, and this time, she didn't look back. Chapter 16. A Ride in the Rain. Redbridge Moor, dusk. The rain began as a mist, cold, insistent, barely there. Arabella felt it on her cheeks like memory. Half-forgotten summers, wild pony rides, days before debut gowns and dowager glances had hemmed her in. The hem of her cloak dragged through sodden grass, already heavy with water. Every step squelched beneath her boots, but still she pressed on, past the hedgerows, beyond the orchard, to where the pasture dipped into the south field. Sebastian had left the hall not long before, refusing help, refusing her. But Arabella hadn't stayed inside. She hadn't stayed quiet. She didn't call out at first, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't ready to hear what he might say in return. A dark figure moved ahead through the rising mist. Sebastian Wolfe, back straight, coat snapping behind him like a warning. He hadn't brought a lantern. Of course he hadn't. Light, after all, made people easier to find. The wind caught the corner of her hood and tugged it free. "Mr. Wolfe," Arabella called. He stopped, turned. The shape of him, broad-shouldered, rain-slicked, all solid stillness, made something in her chest catch. Sebastian said, "You shouldn't be out here. It's cold." Arabella replied, "I've been colder." Then, after a breath, "But I'm not in the habit of running from what I want." He stared at her for a long moment. Wind howled between them. Then he turned and nodded toward the trees. "There's shelter past the oak line." She followed him. It wasn't much. A lambing lean-to, 3 walls and a moss-patched roof leaning against an old stone fence, but it blocked the worst of the wind. Sebastian tethered his mare to a post, then stepped inside and shook the water from his coat. Arabella followed, heart still pounding from the walk. Her gloves were soaked. Her cheeks stung. Her hem was ruined. She didn't care. "I suppose now is when you scold me," she said, brushing water from her cloak. He didn't answer immediately. His breath fogged the air between them. "I'm not going to scold you," he said, "but I don't want to see you hurt." Her eyes met his. "You think I came out here for fun?" "No, I think you came because you're brave." His gaze dropped away. "Braver than me." A silence stretched between them, dense, taut, near unbearable. Rain drummed on the roof in steady rhythm. The field outside disappeared in fog. Arabella stepped closer. Not touching, not yet. "I told my uncle I care for you," she said. That made him look at her. Sharp, surprised. "I didn't use your name," she added softly. "But I didn't have to." "What did he say?" "He told me to know the cost." Sebastian's jaw flexed. "I've spent my whole life behaving," Arabella said. "And for what? My name still gets whispered. My back still gets turned on. So why should I pretend anymore?" His eyes stayed on hers. "You don't have to pretend." "Then stop pretending this doesn't matter." He looked like she'd struck him. "I kissed you because I couldn't stop myself," he said. Sebastian said quietly, "I think about it more than I should. I think about you more than I should." Arabella stepped closer. "Then why are we standing apart?" He hesitated. "Because this world isn't kind to women who choose men like me." "Then let it be unkind," she said fiercely. but don't ask me to live quietly." She stepped closer. His breath caught, their hands brushed, and he flinched. Not away, but as though the contact startled him. "I've been handled like fine china all my life," she said. "Admired, but never truly held." "You'll be ruined," he said. "I already am." He reached out, finally, and cupped her cheek in his hand. It was calloused, warm, real. "I want you," he said quietly. "But I don't want you to regret me. I'd regret never knowing what this felt like." He hesitated only a second longer. Then he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't shy. It was the kind of kiss forged in weeks of silence and almosts, in glances and near touches, in nights full of what-ifs. It was teeth and hands and cold fingers on warm coats. It was rain sliding down her neck and his arm locking around her waist like he'd meant to do it forever. When they broke apart, they were both breathless. Arabella leaned her forehead against his chest. "You think you're not enough," she said. "But I've never been more sure of anything." He didn't answer, but his hand stayed at her back, and they stood that way until the wind softened. Later, as they walked back toward Redbridge in the dark, Sebastian didn't take her hand. But he walked close, close enough that she felt the heat of him with every step. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was watching every time she stumbled. They didn't speak, but the silence had changed. Chapter 17. An Unexpected Caller. Redbridge Hall, the next morning. The fire in the breakfast room crackled gently, casting a warm glow across the pale stone floor. Arabella sat at the round table, a fresh linen napkin in her lap, her teacup half full and quietly cooling. The eggs were perfect this morning, the toast crisp but not scorched. Even the tea had lost its familiar metallic edge. Cook, after 3 weeks of muttering and slamming pots, had at last begun to show signs of effort. Perhaps because Arabella had taken to appearing in the kitchen at irregular hours, inquiring pointedly into boiling times and lard ratios. It was not quite diplomacy, but it had proven effective. Elsie poured the tea with a maid's grace, yet sat with the ease of a confidant. Arabella had not invited her, not allowed, but somehow they shared the table most mornings now. It was irregular, even improper, but then so was exile. A knock echoed through the hall, not the gentle tap of a delivery, nor the soft rhythm of a neighbour's courtesy. This was a summons, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable, the kind of knock meant to be heard and obeyed. Arabella paused, knife in mid-air. "Tell me that's merely the grocer," she murmured. Elsie rose and peeked out the window. She returned a moment later, frowning. "Not the grocer," she said. "Too much polish, too much purpose. Likely someone with a title and an ego to match." Arabella exhaled and stood, smoothing her skirts. Arabella found her uncle in the entrance hall, dressed for company and radiating the weary energy of a man who'd hoped for a quiet morning and received a viscount instead. "Arabella," he muttered under his breath. "You are about to endure a very tedious conversation." The door opened. Viscount Greaves stepped inside, perfectly composed despite the drizzle. His greatcoat was immaculately tailored. His gloves were dry. His hair had not dared misbehave. He surveyed the dim hall with faint disdain, as though surprised the walls had not risen to greet him. "Lady Arabella," he said smoothly. "I thought it best to address matters in person." Arabella replied, cool and measured. "And what, precisely, have you come to address?" "I have written to your mother," he said, removing his gloves. "She agrees that a quiet engagement, properly timed, might yet restore your position." Her uncle gave a dry cough. If you are here to propose, you might consider a more flattering tone. Greaves did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Arabella. I have heard the rumours, he continued, and I am generous enough to overlook them. You have made unfortunate choices. Your reputation has faltered. But I am willing to see past all that. Arabella folded her arms. And in return? You end this dalliance. You stop pretending to prefer stables and solitude. You take your place, as a lady should, at my side. And you expect applause? I expect gratitude. She released a breath, slow, controlled. We've been down this road before, my lord, she said coolly. It is no more appealing the second time. The silence that followed was brittle as frost. Then, You don't want a wife, Greaves, she said coldly. You want a bargain, damaged goods, marked down, still bearing a generous dowry. Greaves's jaw tightened. Do you truly imagine that man can offer you anything? A name? A future? A drawing room in which your presence won't be whispered about? Arabella's voice was ice. I imagine, she said evenly, that he won't dress up demands as kindness. He stepped closer, far too close. You are ruining your life, Arabella. Do not mistake your pride for principles. And do not mistake your arrogance for affection, she replied. He blinked. He had not expected refusal, certainly not one so calm. Your mother will be disappointed. I suspect she already is. He stared at her for one beat longer. Then, with a sharp turn, he departed into the rain. Arabella did not slam the door. She closed it gently. Her uncle scratched the back of his head. Well, that was more decisive than I anticipated. Arabella's voice was quiet, but firm. I'm done being the girl who waits to be chosen. He nodded slowly. Good. Then choose yourself, and do not look back. Back in the breakfast room, the fire had burned down slightly, but the tea was still warm. A second round of toast had appeared. Even the jam had improved. Arabella sat. She buttered her toast with deliberate care. I don't think I want to be saved, she said quietly. At least, not like that. Elsie, now leaning against the hearth, arms folded, tilted her head. No one worth loving wants a rescuer, she said. Just someone who sees them clearly. Arabella took a sip of her tea. No complaints. Chapter 18. The Village Turns. Redbridge Village, 3 days later. The scandal had reached the village before Arabella did, and by the time the curate chose not to mention it in his sermon, everyone already had an opinion. It had spread not by newspaper, but by whisper. From parlour to bakery, from market stall to chapel pew. The butcher's niece had said it first, that the Greystone girl had ridden out with the stablemaster and turned down a viscount. From there it had bloomed, full and fragrant, like foxglove in gossip-rich soil. By the time Arabella stepped into the village square, the cobbles were still slick from last night's rain. Mist clung low over the moor, and her boots left clean impressions in the mud. Her cloak was tightly drawn. A basket looped neatly over one arm. Elsie had offered to accompany her. Arabella had declined. She wasn't there to beg. She wasn't there to charm. She had come simply to be seen. Her first stop was the baker's. The bell chimed softly as she stepped inside, ushered in by warm air thick with cinnamon and suspicion. A freckled girl of 12 stood behind the counter. She startled at the sight of Arabella, then dropped into a curtsy that nearly unseated her apron. Arabella inclined her head. Is Mrs. Aldwych in? She's in the back, my lady, the girl stammered, vanishing behind a curtain like a startled hare. From the far corner, a round woman with a broom had gone very still. pretending to sweep a spot that no longer needed it. Arabella met her gaze. The woman quickly looked away. Let them look. Mrs. Aldwych emerged in a puff of steam and spice. "Lady Arabella," she said, too brightly. "What a surprise." "I've come for the seed cake you promised," Arabella said with calm composure. There was a pause, then a nod, and the cake was wrapped and handed over. Arabella laid her own parcel on the counter. "I've brought tins and blankets for the harvest baskets." Mrs. Aldwych blinked. "That's very generous." "I don't believe generosity ought to be seasonal." The words were soft, but they landed with weight. Mrs. Aldwych gave a quiet thank you. No curtsy this time, but her voice had gentled. Next came the greengrocer, then the butcher, then the herbalists, where the bell had long since gone missing and a black cat perched in the window like a disapproving aunt. In each shop, the pattern repeated, glances, whispers, and a touch of frost, then cracks in the ice. Arabella asked after names. She inquired after fevers. She complimented a girl's needlework. She accepted no favours, but she gave freely. They were not used to ladies in town boots and carrying their own baskets. Certainly not ones who asked after babies and bread prices. By the time she stepped back into the village green, her arms were full. Her cheeks were wind-bitten, and the mist had begun to lift. Near the blacksmiths, a trio of women stood loitering. Lace caps, folded arms, narrowed eyes. One of them whispered. One pretended not to see her. Arabella stopped. "Good morning, Mrs. Bletchley," she said evenly. The woman blinked. "Yes, good morning." "Your roses are still blooming, are they not?" "They are." "I always take it as a good omen when they last past Michaelmas." Mrs. Bletchley cleared her throat. "Well, they've never known how to behave." Arabella smiled. "A fine trait. In roses." She passed the chapel next. Mr. Ashbourne stood near the gate, accepting pleasantries from a pair of matrons. He saw her, but he did not bow. He did not smile. He only nodded. Polite, careful, final. And Arabella nodded back. Whatever hope he'd carried, he had set it down. The milliner's shop stood crooked at the end of the square, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, it smelled of starch and lavender. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 60s, silver hair precisely pinned, a ribbon in her hand like a challenge. "You're the one who turned down the Viscount," she said, matter of fact, "and rides out like she's got no chaperone." "I find the views better without one," Arabella replied. The woman looked her up and down, then set the ribbon aside. "You'll need a better bonnet. One with a lining, windproof. The moor doesn't care how fashionable you look." Arabella stepped closer, a slow smile forming. "I was hoping you'd say that." By the time she left the shop, the sun was clawing its way through the clouds. 2 children ran past her, arms full of apples. A man at the smithy tipped his hat, just slightly. The freckled girl at the bakery window watched her, and this time, she did not look away. Arabella's name still moved through the village, but it no longer sounded like a warning. Not erased. Revised. Chapter 19. What the Heart Remembers. Redbridge Hall, late afternoon. Sebastian had not seen her all morning, not in the stables, not walking the moor. He told himself it meant nothing. She had her own affairs, her own moods, and she was no one's to answer for, least of all his. But as the light through the west window shifted from silver to gold, something inside him stirred, sharp and certain. He missed her. He was elbow-deep in saddle oil when he heard the footsteps. No rustle of skirts, No call of his name, just her presence, calm, unapologetic, like the first break in a storm. He didn't turn. "You weren't here this morning," he said, reaching for a cloth. "I guessed you went to town." I did. A pause. I needed to be seen. He glanced over. She stood in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the wind, her skin luminous against the storm blue of her cloak. A few damp curls had escaped her bonnet, clinging to her temple. Her eyes, sharp, steady, found his at once, unflinching. There was colour in her face, brightness in her mouth. She looked alive. Beautiful, in the way wild things were beautiful. Uncontained, unexpected. "How was your reception?" he asked. "Exactly as you'd expect," she said. Whispers, stares. One woman looked so hard I nearly asked if she wanted a sketch. He gave a low chuckle. "And yet here you are, still standing." She stepped farther into the room. "Turns out the village can endure the shock of seeing me buying seed cake after all." Sebastian set the cloth aside. "Is that why you came down? To report your survival?" "I came for a saddle." Sebastian quickly saddled the mare and led her out without another word. Arabella followed, purposeful, like a woman who'd already chosen her next chapter. "She missed you this morning," he said. Arabella ran her hand along the mare's neck. "And did you?" She didn't look at him, but her voice carried a fragile sort of hope. Light as breath, easy to break. He didn't answer. The silence stretched, not cold, but careful, as if his answer, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. Arabella's mouth curved, wry, but not bitter. "I think I'll call her Bramble." Sebastian's gaze lingered on her hand, still resting on the mare's damp coat. "She won't care what you name her," he said quietly, "but she'll answer to your voice." Arabella glanced at him. "Will you?" He didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on her beautiful face longer than they should have. They rode toward the moor in near silence. The wind had shifted, sweeping down from the hills and rustling the last of the leaves from the trees. The fields shimmered gold and grey beneath a sky too pale for rain, yet not quite clear. The scent of peat and wood smoke followed them. Arabella sat tall in the saddle, but something restless lived in the set of her shoulders. At the halfway point, where the road narrowed between two stone outcrops and the landscape opened wide beyond, she slowed, then stopped altogether. Sebastian drew alongside. "I suppose you heard about my visitor," she said. "I did." She turned her head toward him. "And I didn't kick him in the teeth, if that's what you're asking." A flicker of a smile. Surprising restraint. "He's not worth the bruises." She looked away. "He made an offer like it was a transaction," she said, "as if I were a scandal to be handled, not a woman to be chosen." Sebastian adjusted the reins. "And you'd prefer someone who sees me, not just my name or my disgrace." He said nothing, but she felt the answer in the way he looked at her, direct, unflinching. "And you?" she asked, voice low. "What are you doing out here with me, Mr. Wolfe? Really?" He studied her. The wind had caught her hair, loose strands brushing her cheek. Her eyes were too sharp for naivete, too tired for games. "I came to stop pretending," he said. "Even if it's only here. With you." That startled something in her. A breath, a blink, a trembling stillness. Arabella dismounted first, not gracefully, not like a lady in a painted portrait. Her foot caught on the stirrup, and she landed in the heather with a soft huff of annoyance. Sebastian followed, boots sinking into damp moss. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the ridge, looking out across the moor, raw and endless, the last light of day stretching it into gold. She turned to him. And for once, she did not speak first. She simply reached. He met her halfway, their mouths finding each other without ceremony. Not tentative. Not innocent. A kiss that did not ask permission. It was deliberate, grounded, a choice, not a whim. When she pulled back, her breath hitched. I don't care what they think. I do, he said, but not about them. Her laugh was quiet. That's very nearly poetic. Don't get used to it. They lingered there longer than they ought, the horses grazing behind them, the sky dimming overhead. No vows were made, no grand declarations offered. But Arabella felt steadier now, like something inside her had finally gone still. And Sebastian. He watched her like a man remembering something he once believed he could never have. As they rode back to Redbridge, the air cooled, and a low mist began to rise from the fields. He rode beside her, not ahead, not behind, and Arabella did not look away. Chapter 20. What Comes After. Redbridge Hall, 2 days later. The morning had come in soft and grey. Rain tapped gently at the windows, steady as breath. Not dramatic, no thunder, no wind. Just a quiet persistence. The kind that settles in, the kind that stays. Arabella hadn't slept. She'd watched the ceiling through the slow creep of dawn, her thoughts heavy, her limbs heavier still. Elsie had brought tea, but Arabella hadn't touched it. She didn't move when the fire was stoked. Didn't blink when the bell rang somewhere downstairs. The silence inside her was louder. The letter sat on her desk, folded, unmoved, pinned beneath a fox-shaped paperweight, as if it might escape, as if she might. It wasn't really from her father. The words were his, in name only, penned by his secretary, clipped and cold, disturbingly devoid of sentiment. A voice she barely remembered, now polished into formality by a secretary's hand. She was not to return to the London house for the remainder of the season. Her removal had served its purpose. If she required funds, a modest allowance could be arranged. Her trunks would arrive in a fortnight. Her mother had no further comment. No warmth, no inquiry, no regret. She had been put aside, like an obligation met or a mistake corrected. That evening, she sat in the study, a shawl around her shoulders, a fire burning low. The rain whispered against the glass. A tray sat nearby, half-eaten scones, cold tea, a pot of honey left untouched. The fire offered light, but not warmth, not where it mattered. She didn't hear him at first. Just a hush in the corridor, the soft shift of the latch. Sebastian stepped into the doorway, coat damp at the seams, hair tousled with rain. His boots were muddy. His hands looked washed but not warm. He met her eyes, unapologetic, steady. "You'll catch your death," she said softly. "I've weathered worse," he replied. The pony spooked. I couldn't leave the boy to manage her alone. She didn't rise, but her voice gentled. "The fire's friendly, if you've need of that." He hesitated only a moment, then stepped in, crouching by the hearth, rubbing his hands before the flame. They didn't speak. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of things already said, of things neither knew how to repeat. At last, Arabella lifted the letter from her lap and handed it over. He read it in silence. His expression didn't change. "Nothing I didn't expect," he said. "You're ahead of me." Her voice was low, flat. I hadn't expected such efficiency. He looked at her. Cold doesn't always mean cruel. "I'm not sure it matters," she murmured. "Either way, I've been dismissed." She tried for indifference, but the words tasted of grief. "I'm not sorry," he said. Her eyes lifted, surprised. "They don't deserve you," he added. "Let them keep their drawing rooms and illusions. Let them whisper that you were the scandal." She drew the shawl tighter. "It's not the rejection that wounds me," she said. "It's the relief." I read that letter and felt free. She blinked once, then again. And then, without warning, her eyes filled. No sobs, no dramatic unravelling, just tears. Quiet, persistent. The kind that slipped down her cheek without apology. Sebastian said nothing. He didn't need to. She hesitated. "It makes me feel like I wasted years trying to be someone they never loved." He crossed to the tray and poured the tea, lukewarm, but steady. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, not for the tea, but for him. Then, after a pause, "Do you think I'm selfish?" "No." His voice was sure. "I think you're finally loving the right person," he said. Her eyes flicked to his. "Myself? Or someone who sees you clearly?" Something shifted in her. "Sebastian," she said, the name unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. "What are we doing?" He set down his cup. "You tell me." "I kissed you on the moor. I remember. I don't regret it." "Good. But I should. I'm a lady. And you're... I know what I am." She stood. He followed. "You shouldn't love me," she said softly. "Not if you want a quiet life." "You think I haven't tried not to?" He stepped closer. "I've reasoned, ignored, denied. And I failed utterly." Her defences crumbled like frost. "I've never belonged anywhere," she said. "Not truly." I curtsied, I smiled, I learned their rules. And they closed the door behind me. He reached for her hand, not like a gentleman, but like a man who had already chosen. "I can't give you their world," he said. "I don't want to." She studied him. "Then what would you give me?" He lifted her hand to his chest. "Honesty. Safety. Myself." Her throat tightened. "And scandal." He smiled. Soft. Rueful. "They'll whisper no matter what you do. Let it be about us." A long silence, then softly. "My darling Arabella." He kissed her. There was no uncertainty. No question, only reverence, certainty, and the quiet relief of being known and wanted and safe. That night she did not sleep alone. Not in sin, not in shame, but in the soft, steady comfort of knowing. She had chosen a home, and been chosen in return. Epilogue. Spring comes to Redbridge. Redbridge, Sussex, April 1816. The trees were greening once more. Winter's hush had lifted, and the moor beyond the orchard stretched wide and waking beneath a sky of endless blue. Crocuses had pushed through the softened earth. The hens had begun laying with renewed enthusiasm, and something gentler than spring was beginning to bloom. Arabella stood on the stone steps of Redbridge Hall, bareheaded. Her hair was pinned in soft waves. The hem of her pale dress bore a splash of mud, just enough to speak of real life. She wasn't waiting, not for a letter, not for a summons, not for anything. For the first time in her life, she simply was. The front door creaked open behind her. "I told you the ground's still wet," came a familiar voice. Arabella smiled but didn't turn. "I'll ruin another hem tomorrow," she said. Sebastian stepped beside her. His coat was open, His hair looked combed for once, and he carried a small bundle of seed packets in one hand. "I don't suppose you've had a change of heart about planting these?" Arabella turned at last, took the packets from his hand, and read the labels. Marigolds, lavender, sweet peas. "The stable yard?" she asked. He shrugged. "You said it needed softening." "I said it looked like a prison yard," she corrected. "And you said that kindly." They had stayed at Redbridge, not as guests, not as exiles, as something else entirely. Arabella had not become someone new. She had simply stopped hiding who she was. And Redbridge, once a place she'd been sent to forget herself, had become the first place where she truly belonged. Her uncle had offered Sebastian the formal title of steward some weeks ago, official recognition for what he had already been. He too seemed lighter these days. The lines around his eyes had eased, and there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. Especially when he spoke of the orchard, or the village school, or the children who now came running to the chapel steps on Sunday mornings. He kept to his early hours and his quiet sermons, but he lingered longer at the table after supper. He took to walking the orchard paths again, hands clasped behind his back, whistling low and tunelessly beneath his breath. He never said it aloud, but Arabella could see it in the way he looked at her, at them. He was happy. The books were now balanced, the fences mended, the horses healthier than ever. As for Arabella, she had set about putting the house in order with quiet determination, coaxing reluctant maids into routines, opening shuttered rooms, and introducing a weekly menu that did not rely entirely on stewed cabbage and dried suet. Even cook had stopped muttering, though she still rolled her eyes when Arabella suggested breakfast pastries. Redbridge was no longer a relic. It was theirs. There was no announcement, no engagement ball, no notice in the Times. Just a quiet conversation by the fire and a morning that began not with spectacle, but with certainty. Her uncle had married them in the chapel behind the orchard. Elsie had stood beside her, awkward in her best gown. Sebastian's hand closed tightly around hers. It wasn't the wedding her mother had imagined. It was better. Sebastian reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. His skin was warm, familiar. "You haven't run for the hills yet?" she asked. Sebastian replied, dryly as ever, "Not yet. Even after I told the stable lad you once slipped on a frozen puddle and fell in the trough." He winced. "You're never going to let that go." "Never," she said, all too pleased. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. He kissed her hair. "I like it here," she said softly. "Even the mud?" he asked. "Especially the mud." She laid her free hand gently across her abdomen, almost without thought, as if her body already knew what her mind had only begun to wonder. In the distance, bells rang faintly from the village. A pair of birds darted through the hedgerow. Arabella tilted her face up to the sun and let the moment stretch. Not a ball, not a scandal, not a cautionary tale. Just a morning, a man, a garden that needed planting, and a life that was finally hers. A quiet story, perhaps, but hers, and already it was beginning to grow. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. New tales drop every Tuesday, or on Sundays if you're one of the clever few who've tapped the join button. It costs less than a bonnet ribbon and comes with far fewer strings attached. And if you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, you can tap that thanks button right below. It's far less scandalous than slipping coins into a reticule. I'll be back soon with another story, unless I've floated off into the clouds like this little bell.